coverage leading up to the Iraq invasion.
And he has an upcoming book by that title. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you with us. Can you respond to this front page story in the Washington Post?
Yes, I was very encouraged by it. It was a good piece. It was prominently displayed. It was particularly significant, I think, both for documenting actually what the Post did and did not do in its coverage, and then also getting these very straightforward quotes from Len Downey, as we just heard, and other editors reflecting on what happened. The editors there had different views on it, but Len Downey, the man in charge, really was just very frank in saying, basically, we blew it. I think Kurtz did a good job in talking to people like Ricks. I didn't know about that Ricks story that got killed, and that was a real stunner. And that he is so obviously these reporters are still rankled by a lot of this, and they're talking on the record about it, and that the Post ran it. It's part of a process that is now occurring where papers like the Post and the Times are trying to come to terms with how much they blew the run up to the war.
Well, but in essence, aren't they coming to terms with the reality of how badly the war has gone now, so that it's okay now to be able to question your own mistakes? Because, for instance, Downey says in that article that that the voices were lonely ones opposing the war, but there were people like Scott Ritter, a former head of Unscum, or former chief of a player in Unscum, who was interviewed on this show, who I wrote about the Daily News, who was talking all around the country, saying that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, and that he knew because he had been involved in eradicating the original weapons supply. So there was plenty of evidence out there if only they had chosen to listen.
Well, the Scott Ritter case is complicated because he flipped himself. He was a big hawk, and then he changed, and he got involved in making a documentary that the source of funding, who knows what. But beyond that, you're absolutely right. There were a lot of people. There were a lot of military people, such as the ones in the Ricks article, who were dissenting. There were people in the streets by the tens of thousands who were all put, again, on inside pages. And you're absolutely right. It's only because the war has gone badly that now people are looking back. And frankly, I fear that in another period when sort of we have a popular president pushing a policy, that the press will again show the sort of spinelessness that it did in this period.
I'm looking at the piece, which had started on the front page and then goes to almost a full page on the inside. And it quotes Leonard Downey saying, "We're so focused on trying to figure out what the administration was doing, we're not giving the same play to people who said it wouldn't be a good idea to go to war, and we're questioning the administration's rationale. Not enough of those stories were put on the front page. That was a mistake on my part. Across the country," he said, "the voices raising questions about the war were lonely ones. We didn't pay enough attention to the minority." Now, this is what I wanted to ask you about. Are we really talking about the minority? If you look at the polls leading up to the invasion of Iraq, half the people in this country were opposed to war, for more inspections and more diplomacy. Is he saying we didn't give enough attention to the minority? Is that what it is? Or is it simply we give too much attention to those in power, and those in power actually reflect the minority? We're talking about people in this country being the silenced majority, silenced by corporate media like the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the networks.
Well, I think you're onto something there. In another quote, I thought one of the most revealing, Karen DeYoung, one of the top editors, said that, let's face it, we're basically a mouthpiece for whatever administration is in power. And I think that she is basically saying that that's the reality, let's face it, but it's an amazing admission of how our major media have, in fact, served as conveyor belts. And this was a classic case of it. I think that one thing missing from this article was a true wrestling with the roots of the failure. And I think the roots do go to the fact that the media have gotten so much toward a position to be handmaidens to the people in power.
Might you say embedded in our elite in this country?
Yes, certainly. That's it. I mean, dinner parties going on in which high officials go to the houses of journalists. Journalists wanting to get, I mean, for instance, Pentagon correspondents flying with Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz to Iraq and Afghanistan. They want to be on that plane, and they know that if they write things that are too critical, they're not going to get seats there. Also, the fear Dana Priest, a reporter for the Post, talking about the hate mail they got. I also quoted that in the piece that I wrote for the New York Review. There's an atmosphere of intimidation now. We've got a whole constellation from Fox News to Rush Limbaugh to all these rabid talk show hosts and the administration itself, ready to pounce on anyone who sticks their neck, any nail that comes up, they're going to hammer it down. And your career can be shredded if you speak out too much against those in power.
Well, interestingly, the self-criticisms have come so far, at least among daily newspapers, from the New York Times and the Washington Post, both of whom, while they may be influential among opinion makers in the country, really do not reach masses of Americans across the nation, and both of which, because they are largely, although they're publicly traded corporations, are still largely family controlled, and therefore have a certain amount of independence. But you're not seeing any self-criticism yet from the huge chains, the Gannett's and the Knight Ritters and the Tribune companies, who have many newspapers and who are really
Knight Ritter. We just that is one organization that actually distinguished itself, as I tried to show. They were one of the few places that actually did give voice to more of the dissent about the war. So it's a mixed bag. But you're right. I mean, the Times and the Post have been the ones. But let's face it, they do have a big agenda-setting role. All the TV networks read them and so on. So I do feel it's healthy that this is happening. I mean, it's really late. I mean, it's 16 months after the war that they're finally wrestling with this. Why did it take them so long? And will it stop them from the next time again that I see even now, like as somebody on the web was writing, the handover of power, the sovereignty in Iraq, there was a huge fall off in coverage. It's sort of like, okay, like we're disengaging. The press, let's disengage. Look at Afghanistan. The press just ignoring that. What is going on there? How often does that story get on the front page? Again, we're seeing the agenda get set by the administration, and even our top news organizations sort of meekly follow along.
Looking at the piece again, the Post on WMD's an inside story. They write, from August 2002 through March 19, 2003, launched to war, the Post ran more than 140 front-page stories that focused heavily on administration rhetoric against Iraq. Some examples. These are the headlines. Cheney says Iraqi strike is justified. War cabinet argues for Iraq attack. Bush tells United Nations it must stand up to Hussein or U.S. will. Bush cites urgent Iraqi threat. Bush tells troops prepare for war. Reporter Karen Young, a former assistant managing editor who covered the pre-war diplomacy, said contrary information sometimes got lost. She said the caution and the questioning was buried underneath the drumbeat. The hugeness of war preparation story tended to drown out a lot of stuff. And then they look at that key Colin Powell speech, February 5th, 2003. At the UN, and it says the tendencies were on display on February 6th, the day after Powell delivered a multimedia presentation at the UN using satellite images and intercepted phone calls to convince the world that Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction. An accompanying front-page story by DeYoung and Walter Pincus examined Powell's unprecedented release of U.S. intelligence. Not until the 9th paragraph did they offer a however clause, saying that a number of European officials and U.S. terrorism experts believe that Powell's description of an Iraqi link to al-Qaeda, quote, appeared to have been carefully drawn to imply more than it actually said. I mean, this is an absolutely key point, and this goes beyond the Washington Post. That period, in the week leading up to Powell's address and the week afterwards, that 2-week period, FAIR study, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, the Media Watch Group, of the 4 major nightly newscasts, NBC, ABC, CBS, and PBS's NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. Of these 4 nightly newscasts, there were 393 interviews done around war. Only 3 were with anti-war representatives, out of almost 400 in this critical period in the lead up to war, when people are making up their minds, although more than half were at that point opposed. Response?
Well, I looked at the Colin Powell speech and the reaction to it when I was doing my analysis, and I think that speech and the period surrounding it is going to go down as a textbook case of a failure of proper press scrutiny of administration statements. Those quotes that you have there could be multiplied many times. They are excruciatingly embarrassing now when you look at them. Unfortunately, Kurtz did not look at the Washington Post editorial page, which was probably the leading cheerleader in the print media for the war.